The wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, an untamed and unbroken land that seemed to whisper promises of freedom and prosperity. To the pioneers who ventured westward, the dense forests and sprawling mountains held the allure of possibility, a fresh start far from the chaos and constraints of the towns they left behind. Yet, for all its beauty, the frontier was no place for the faint-hearted. Its grandeur masked an unforgiving landscape, where the line between life and death was thin, and those who dared to challenge its secrets often paid a heavy price. Among the hopeful was the Carter family, who journeyed for months to stake their claim in the heart of Washington's ancient forests. Their wagon creaked and groaned under the weight of their belongings, their dreams, and their determination. It was said that these woods were unlike any other, a primal expanse untouched by the hand of man. Towering trees, some centuries old, loomed overhead, their canopies so thick they blotted out the sun. The air was heavy with the scent of moss and earth, a reminder of how insignificant humanity seemed in the presence of such overwhelming nature. But for all its promise, there was an uncanny stillness to the place. Birds sang and the wind whispered through the leaves, yet it wasn't enough to banish the nagging sense that something was off. The deeper the family ventured into the forest, the more they felt it, an unshakable feeling of being watched. At first, Thomas Carter, the family's stern yet hopeful patriarch, dismissed these concerns as nerves. They were simply adjusting to their new life, he assured his wife, Mary, and their two children. After all, it was a land of mystery and awe. Perhaps that was all they were feeling. But Mary couldn't shake the sensation. Every rustling bush, every snap of a twig seemed louder than it should have been. At night, as they sat around the crackling fire, the shadows cast by the flames seemed too large, too alive. And though Thomas would have none of her superstitions, she began to sleep with a hunting knife under her pillow, just in case. It was on their fifth night that they first heard it, the sound that would forever alter their lives. A howl broke through the silence of the forest, unlike anything they'd ever heard. Low, guttural, and drawn out, it sent a chill racing down their spines. It wasn't a wolf's cry, nor the screech of a mountain lion. It was deeper, more primal, and disturbingly human. The sound echoed through the trees, as though the forest itself were alive and screaming. Thomas brushed it off as the call of an animal, though even his voice faltered as he spoke. The children huddled close to their mother, and Mary couldn't help but grip her knife tighter. Whatever it was, it didn't sound natural or welcome. The next morning, the family awoke to find their supplies disturbed. Their provisions, which had been carefully stored the night before, were scattered about the camp, and something heavy had left massive indentations in the earth near their wagon. Thomas knelt beside the tracks, his brow furrowed. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen, larger than any man's footprint, yet undeniably human in shape. From that moment on, the Carters began to understand that they were not alone. Whatever had made those tracks was watching, waiting. The forest was no longer a refuge, but a labyrinth of secrets. And as the wind picked up, carrying with it faint echoes of that unholy howl, one truth became terrifyingly clear. This land did not belong to them. They were intruders, and something ancient, wanted them gone. The days that followed were uneasy, filled with tension that thickened with each passing hour. The forest seemed quieter now, as if holding its breath, waiting. The Carter family tried to carry on with their work, chopping wood, digging trenches, small caring, their small cabin, but every task was accompanied by awareness of the forest around them. Thomas kept his rifle close, never straying far from the camp. Mary's eyes darted constantly to the tree line, her hands trembling as she tended to the children. Even the smallest sound, a snapping branch, a rustling bush, set their nerves on edge. It was Emily, the Carters' 12-year-old daughter, who first saw it. She had been sent to collect water from the nearby stream, a short distance from the cabin, but far enough to feel the weight of isolation. The air was still, the only sounds the gentle trickle of the stream and the occasional call of a distant bird. She was crouched at the water's edge, filling her bucket, when she felt it. A presence. Slowly, she lifted her head, and there, across the stream, partially hidden by the trees, it stood. At first, Emily thought it might be a man, a traveler perhaps, though the sheer size of the figure made her breath catch in her throat. It towered over the underbrush, its massive frame covered in thick, dark hair that glistened faintly in the dappled sunlight. Its face, though partially obscured by shadows, was unmistakably human yet terrifyingly primal, with deep-set eyes that glowed a faint amber. Those eyes were fixed on her, unblinking, studying her as if trying to decide whether she was a threat or prey. Emily froze, her breath shallow and her heart pounding in her chest. The creature didn't move. It simply stood there, watching, its broad chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved, locked in a silent standoff. And then, as if sensing her fear, the creature tilted its head slightly, a gesture that felt disturbingly intelligent. Emily could no longer hold back a scream. The sound shattered the stillness, echoing through the trees and carrying back to the cabin. Thomas, hearing his daughter's cry, bolted toward the stream with his rifle in hand. By the time he arrived, Emily was trembling on the ground, her bucket overturned, the water soaking into the earth. The creature was gone. What happened? What did you see? Thomas demanded, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the intruder. But Emily couldn't speak. She could only point to the trees, her face pale and her hands shaking. That night, the family barricaded themselves inside their cabin. Thomas, now on edge, confessed what had been gnawing at him since they'd first seen the tracks. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't an animal. Its movements, its behavior, even the way it had left their supplies scattered, it was too deliberate, too calculated. This was something else, something intelligent. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Mary whispered a prayer under her breath, her voice trembling. The children huddled together, their wide eyes fixed on the windows, half expecting the creature to appear at any moment. Outside, the forest remained eerily quiet, as if even the animals knew to stay hidden. Then, just as the family began to drift into a restless sleep, the howl came again, louder this time, closer. It carried with it a primal energy, a sound that made their blood run cold. The forest, so silent moments before, now seemed alive with movement, the faint snapping of branches, the rustle of leaves. Whatever was out there, it was no longer content to watch from the shadows. Something had changed, and the Carters knew they had crossed a line they could never uncross. The forest no longer felt like a place to call home. It was a predator's domain, and they were its prey. The dawn broke over the forest, but it brought no comfort. The Carter family emerged from their cabin to find their homestead eerily untouched, as if mocking their fear. The world outside seemed almost normal in the light of day, but the weight of the night's events lingered heavily in the air. Thomas, weary from keeping watch through the night, scanned the perimeter with his rifle slung across his shoulder. There were no tracks, no signs of disturbance. Whatever had prowled outside their walls had been careful, deliberate. The family wasn't alone in their fear. Word of strange happenings spread quickly among the neighboring settlers. Though their homesteads were scattered across miles of dense forest, the stories carried a haunting familiarity. Livestock had gone missing, fences were found torn apart, and supplies left unsecured had been ransacked. Samuel Turner, a grizzled and pragmatic hunter who had lived in the wilderness longer than most, claimed to have seen the creature himself. "It was by the stream," Turner said, his voice low and gravelly as a small group of settlers gathered near his homestead to hear his tale. "I was tracking deer, following a fresh set of prints. But then I found something else, another set of tracks, much bigger than anything I've seen in these woods. I thought it might have been a bear, but the shape wasn't right. They were feet, bare, human-like feet, only twice the size they ought to be." The crowd murmured uneasily, but Turner's expression silenced them. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with something between fear and certainty. "I saw it, down by the water. It was crouched, drinking, and it didn't see me at first. It wasn't an animal, I'll tell you that much. It stood up on two legs, tall as a tree, and it looked at me. Not just glanced, looked, studied me." The settlers exchanged nervous glances. Turner was not a man prone to exaggeration. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "I don't know what it is, but it doesn't belong here. And it's watching us." Thomas listened in grim silence. He had hoped the events of the past week were isolated, some strange anomaly that would pass in time. But now it was clear this wasn't just about his family. Whatever was lurking in the forest was something far larger than they had dared imagine. That night, Thomas resolved to take action. He joined a small patrol of settlers, armed with rifles and lanterns, to investigate the surrounding woods. They walked in tense silence, their senses heightened by the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. The forest, so alive during the day, seemed to close in around them at night. Every step felt heavier, every shadow deeper. As the group reached the edge of the stream where Turner had claimed to see the creature, the air grew unnaturally still. The usual hum of crickets and distant owls had vanished, replaced by an uneasy quiet that seemed to press against their ears. Then they heard it. A low, rumbling growl, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each second. The men froze, their lanterns swinging wildly as they tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the trees like a warning. "Show yourself!" one of the settlers shouted, raising his rifle. His voice cracked, betraying his fear. The growl stopped, replaced by the faint sound of heavy footsteps moving away into the forest. They were impossibly fast, covering ground with a speed that defied explanation. The men remained frozen, their hearts pounding, until the sound faded into the distance. When they returned to their homesteads, their faces were pale, their hands trembling. None of them spoke of what they had heard, but the fear was evident in their eyes. They had glimpsed something they couldn't understand, something that didn't fit within the boundaries of their world. And as the forest closed in around them once more, they knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. The night after the patrol returned, a storm swept through the forest, bringing with it a ferocious wind that howled through the trees like a living thing. Rain battered the roof of the Carter family's cabin, each drop sounding like a drumbeat on the wooden planks. Inside, the family huddled around the fire, its flickering glow casting uneasy shadows across the room. Despite the walls around them, the storm did little to make them feel secure. The woods outside seemed alive, filled with a restless energy that no amount of thunder could drown out. Thomas sat near the door, his rifle resting across his lap. He hadn't slept in days, his eyes bloodshot and his jaw set in a grim line. Mary tried to distract the children by reading aloud from one of the few books they had brought on the journey, but her voice was strained, her words faltering with every gust of wind or creak of the cabin walls. Outside, the storm raged, caged back, but beneath the sound of the rain, another noise began to emerge. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, a heavy thudding like something large moving through the forest. Thomas held up a hand, silencing Mary mid-sentence. The family froze, their ears straining against the din of the storm. The thudding grew louder, more deliberate, until it seemed to be circling the cabin. Whatever it was massive, its weight causing the ground to tremble ever so slightly with each step. Then came the sound they had all dreaded, the scratching at the walls. Long, deliberate scrapes, as though claws were being dragged across the wooden planks. It started at the back of the cabin and slowly worked its way around, moving with an unnerving precision. Thomas rose to his feet, gripping his rifle tightly. Mary pulled the children close, her arms trembling as she whispered hurried prayers under her breath. As the scratching reached the front of the cabin, the family could hear the deep, guttural breathing of whatever was outside. It was close. Too close. Thomas moved to the window, his hands shaking as he peered into the darkness. Lightning flashed, illuminating the figure for the briefest of moments. What he saw made his stomach drop. The creature was even larger than he had imagined, its broad shoulders and massive frame dwarfing the cabin itself. Its matted fur was slick with rain, and its amber eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity. It stood motionless for a moment, staring directly at the window, as if it knew Thomas was watching. Then it roared. The sound was deafening, a primal scream that seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. The children cried out, burying their faces in Mary's arms. Thomas fired a shot through the window, the sound of the gunfire swallowed by the storm. When the lightning flashed again, the creature was gone. For a moment, the only sound was the pounding of the rain and the frantic breathing of the family inside. But then came another noise, a heavy thud on the roof. The creature had climbed onto the cabin. Panic overtook them. Mary ushered the children into the root cellar, herding them down the narrow staircase as Thomas reloaded his rifle. The thudding on the roof grew louder, each impact shaking dust from the ceiling beams. Thomas fired again, this time through the roof, but the noise only seemed to enrage the beast. It let out another roar, a sound so guttural and feral it seemed to come from the depths of the forest itself. Down in the cellar, the family could hear the scratching return, this time above their heads. It was searching for a way in, its heavy footsteps moving back and forth across the roof. Thomas stood at the base of the stairs, his rifle aimed at the door, ready for whatever might come next. But the attack never came. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the creature vanished, leaving behind only the sound of the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. The family stayed in the cellar until dawn, too terrified to emerge. When they finally crept back upstairs, they found the cabin in ruins. Deep gashes scarred the walls, the roof was partially caved in, and the ground outside was littered with massive footprints that led back into the forest. The storm had passed, but the terror remained. The Carters knew then that this was no ordinary predator. It wasn't hunting them for food, it was warning them. They were intruders, and the forest wanted them gone. The morning light revealed the true extent of the damage. The Carter cabin, once a symbol of their determination and dreams of a new life, now stood battered and broken. The roof bore deep claw marks, and sections of the walls were splintered as if something had to tear its way inside. The air still carried the acrid scent of gunpowder from Thomas's desperate shots during the night. Around the cabin, the ground was a mess of oversized footprints, each one pressed deep into the mud, as if the earth itself had buckled under the weight of the creature. The other settlers soon gathered at the Carters' homestead, drawn by the sound of gunfire during the storm. Faces grim and voices hushed, they surveyed the destruction, their disbelief mingling with a growing sense of dread. If there had been any lingering doubts about the creature's existence, the evidence now lay before them. It was real, and it wasn't going anywhere. "We can't keep pretending this is something we can handle," Samuel Turner finally said, breaking the tense silence. His voice, usually steady and authoritative, now carried a note of unease. "This thing isn't afraid of us, it's toying with us, letting us know it's in control." The settlers debated their options, their voices rising as fear began to overwhelm reason. Some argued for staying and fighting, proposing traps and patrols to protect their homes. Others, visibly shaken, insisted they pack up and leave before the creature decided to escalate its attacks. The discussion quickly devolved into chaos, the group splintering as panic took hold. Thomas, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "This isn't just about one family or one night. This creature, whatever it is, it doesn't want us here, and I don't think it's going to stop until we're gone." His words hung heavy in the air, a grim truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Mary, standing close to her husband, placed a hand on his arm. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights, but her voice was steady. "It's not just our lives at stake, it's our children. If we stay, we're putting them in danger." The group fell silent, their fear replaced by an even deeper unease, an acknowledgement that she was right. This was no longer about proving their strength or staking their claim on the land. This was survival, pure and simple. That evening, the settlers held a final meeting. The decision was made. They would leave. Though it broke their hearts to abandon the land they had worked so hard to tame, the cost of staying was too great. They would pack what they could carry and make the difficult journey back toward the nearest settlement, leaving the forest and its secrets behind. As the settlers prepared to depart, the forest seemed to watch them. The once vibrant trees now felt oppressive, their branches twisting like grasping fingers. The distant sounds of the wilderness, birdsong, the rustle of leaves, felt like whispers, as if the forest itself was mocking their retreat. For the Carters, the decision to leave was both a relief and a heartbreak. Emily clung to her mother as they loaded their belongings onto their wagon, her wide eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Thomas, ever the stoic, lingered outside the cabin for a moment, his rifle in hand. He stared into the forest, his gaze hard and unyielding, as if daring the creature to show itself one last time. But the woods remained silent, the shadows deep and impenetrable. As the wagons began to roll away, the settlers cast one last look back at their homesteads. The forest, still and silent under the fading light, seemed to sigh with relief. Whatever had haunted them was no longer visible, but they could feel its presence, watching, waiting. The pioneers knew they would never return to this place, not in this lifetime. The forest belonged to something far older and far more powerful than them, and it had made its claim clear. As the trees closed behind them, the settlers carried with them not just their belongings, but the weight of what they had experienced, a story they would tell in whispers, a legend that would live on long after they were gone. The journey back to civilization was slow and somber, a procession of wagons winding through the dense forest like a line of ants fleeing a storm. The settlers spoke little, their faces drawn and pale. Every creak of the wheels, every snap of a branch underfoot seemed to echo too loudly in the oppressive quiet. The forest, once alive with the songs of birds and the rustling of wildlife, now felt utterly devoid of sound. It was as if the woods were holding its breath, watching them go. For the Carters, every mile felt heavier than the last. Emily sat in the back of the wagon, her knees tucked to her chest, her wide eyes scanning the trees. Mary clutched her hands tightly in her lap, her lips moving in silent prayers. Thomas walked alongside the wagon, his rifle always at the ready. His posture was rigid, his eyes flicking to every shadow and flicker of movement in the underbrush. He was certain they were being followed. The other settlers felt it too, though no one dared to say it out loud. Occasionally, one of them would glance back, their gaze lingering on the path they had left behind. The forest felt alive with unseen eyes, the sensation of being watched more suffocating with every step. They tried to convince themselves it was just their imaginations, but deep down, they all knew better. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, the settlers decided to make camp for the night. They chose a clearing near a small creek, the sound of running water providing a brief illusion of peace. The men set up a perimeter, their lanterns casting long, flickering shadows as they prepared for the night. Fires were lit, and the group gathered close, their voices hushed as they discussed how much farther they had to go. No one dared mention the creature, but its presence hung over them like a storm cloud. Thomas took the first watch, his rifle resting against his shoulder as he stood at the edge of the clearing. The forest beyond the firelight was an impenetrable wall of darkness, the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. He strained his ears for any sound, footsteps, breathing, the low growl they had come to fear, but all he heard was the faint rustle of leaves. And then, just as he was beginning to think they might be safe, it came. A distant, guttural howl, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. It was far off, but it sent a chill down Thomas's spine. He turned back to the camp, his face grim as he signaled to the other men. They quickly doused the fires, plunging the clearing into darkness. The settlers huddled together, their weapons ready, as the forest seemed to come alive with sound. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and faint, heavy footsteps echoed in the distance. The howls came again, closer this time, reverberating through the trees like a warning. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just one creature. There were more of them. The night stretched on, the settlers too terrified to sleep. The sounds continued, sometimes near, sometimes far, as if the creatures were circling the camp, testing their resolve. Occasionally, someone would catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing, a shadow too large to be a deer, a flash of amber eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. But the creatures never attacked. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to drive the settlers to the brink of panic. By the time dawn broke, the group was exhausted, their nerves frayed. The sounds had stopped sometime in the early hours, but no one felt any relief. As they packed up their camp and resumed their journey, the forest seemed to close in around them once more, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. Thomas walked in silence, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He didn't look back, didn't dare to. He could feel the weight of the forest behind him, the unrelenting gaze of something ancient and powerful. It wasn't just watching. It was following, and though they were putting more distance between themselves and the heart of the forest, Thomas knew it wasn't far enough. It would never be far enough. The settlers finally emerged from the forest 2 days later, the dense canopy giving way to open skies and rolling plains. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they could see the horizon again. The air felt lighter here, untainted by the oppressive weight of the woods. Yet none of them could shake the unease that had settled deep in their bones. They had escaped the forest, but the experience clung to them like a shadow. refusing to let go. For the Carters, the relief of leaving the forest was tempered by the knowledge of what they had left behind. Their dreams of a new life, their hard work, their belief in the promise of the frontier, all of it had been abandoned to the darkness of those ancient trees. As they continued toward the nearest settlement, the family spoke little, their thoughts consumed by the haunting events they had endured. Emily, once a spirited and curious child, now sat silently in the wagon, her wide eyes staring blankly ahead. Mary, though outwardly composed, clutched a small wooden cross in her hand, her knuckles white from the pressure. And Thomas, ever the stoic, walked beside the wagon, his rifle still in his hand, as if expecting the forest to reach out and drag them back. When they reached the settlement, the other settlers they encountered were eager to hear their story. Whispers of strange happenings in the wilderness had already circulated to death, and the Carters' arrival only added fuel to the rumors. But as Thomas stood before the gathered crowd recounting the events of the past weeks, he found his words met with disbelief. The footprints, the howls, the scratches on the cabin, none of it seemed possible to those who had never ventured into the deep woods. To them, the Carters' tale was just that, a tale born of fear and isolation. Some scoffed, others dismissed it outright, and a few nodded solemnly, their expressions betraying a quiet understanding. Those who had lived near the forest longest, the ones who had heard the whispers of their ancestors, knew there were truths hidden in the land that could not be explained away. They warned the Carters that some places were not meant for man to inhabit, that the forest was older and more powerful than they could comprehend. As days turned into weeks, the Carters tried to rebuild their lives in the safety of the settlement, but the shadow of the forest never left them. Emily refused to sleep without a lantern burning brightly by her bedside, her dreams plagued by visions of glowing amber eyes. Mary busied herself with chores and prayer, yet she would often stop and stare out the window, her mind drifting back to the cabin and the nights spent huddled in fear. Thomas, though outwardly strong, was haunted by the knowledge that he had failed to protect his family from something he could neither fight nor understand. The other settlers who had fled the forest scattered, each family choosing to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the wilderness. Over time, the story of what happened in the forest began to fade, reduced to a cautionary tale whispered around campfires. But for the Carters, the memory remained vivid, a constant reminder of the horrors they had faced. Years later, as Thomas sat on the porch of his modest home, now an older man with silver streaking his hair, he still found his thoughts drifting back to the forest. He would never forget the way it had felt, alive, sentient, and watching. He often wondered if the creature or creatures still roamed those dark woods, biding their time, guarding the secrets of a land that did not belong to men. Some nights, when the wind was just right, Thomas swore he could hear it, the faint echo of that primal howl carried across the plains like a ghostly reminder of what lay beyond the trees. It wasn't close, but it didn't need to be. He knew it was still out there, a part of the wilderness that no man could tame, a force that would remain long after he and his family were gone. And though he had left the forest behind, he knew it would never truly leave him. The year was 1879, and the promise of a new life brought families westward into the uncharted wilderness. The Pacific Northwest, with its towering mountains and sprawling forests, seemed like a land of endless opportunity. For the Halstead family, the dream of freedom, self-reliance, and prosperity outweighed the risks of the unknown. With a wagon loaded full of supplies and their hearts filled with hope, they made their way into the deep, ancient forests of Washington Territory. The journey was long and arduous, but when they arrived at a clearing nestled between a winding stream and the imposing Cascade Mountains, it felt like destiny. The forest was breathtaking. Trees so tall they seemed to scrape the heavens, their massive trunks wrapped in moss and vines stood like sentinels guarding an untouched world. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and earth. It was a stark contrast to the crowded industrial towns they had left behind. But this land was wild, unbroken. It bore none of the marks of human hands. And though the Halsteads were captivated by its beauty, there was something else about the forest, something older and darker that lingered just out of sight. At first, it was just a feeling, a quiet, creeping unease, like being watched by something you couldn't see. Thomas Halstead, the family's strong-willed patriarch, dismissed these feelings as nerves. After all, this was a new beginning, a chance to carve out a future in an untouched wilderness. His wife, Margaret, tried to share his optimism, though she couldn't ignore the eerie quiet that settled over the clearing at night. Their children, 11-year-old Emily and 8-year-old Samuel, seemed oblivious to the tension as they explored the forest edges, finding wonder in every leaf and stone. The first nights passed uneventfully. The family worked tirelessly to build their cabin, each swing of the axe bringing them closer to the life they had envisioned. The rhythmic sound of chopping wood echoed through the trees, a declaration of their presence in this wild land. Yet, as the days wore on, the forest began to feel less welcoming. It started with strange noises in the night. At first, it was distant, branches snapping, leaves rustling. Normal forest sounds, Thomas assured Margaret, but then came the howl. It was unlike anything they'd ever heard. Low and guttural, it carried through the trees, its tone resonating deep in their chests. It wasn't the cry of a wolf or the call of a cougar. It was something else, something they couldn't name. Margaret woke Thomas that night, her voice trembling. "Did you hear that?" she asked. He nodded, gripping the rifle that now rested by their bed. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds, branches snapping and faint, heavy thuds like footsteps far too heavy to belong to any human. Emily and Samuel, shaken by the noises, clung to their mother. Thomas reassured them it was just an animal passing through, though even he didn't believe it. The unease grew the next morning when they discovered their supplies had been disturbed. Bags of flour had been overturned and tools were scattered around the clearing. More unsettling were the tracks. Massive, human-like footprints pressed into the soft earth. Thomas crouched beside them, his brow furrowing as he measured the size with his hand. They were too large for any man, too precise for a bear. Margaret stood behind him, clutching Samuel's hand. "What could have made those?" she whispered. Thomas didn't answer. He simply stood and scanned the forest, his rifle now slung tightly over his shoulder. The woods, once a place of promise and hope, now loomed with a foreboding presence. The trees seemed closer, darker, their branches casting strange shadows in the morning light. Whatever had left those tracks wasn't far, and it wasn't finished. The Halsteads tried to go about their work as usual, but the unease lingered, a shadow that refused to lift. Thomas doubled his efforts on the cabin, pushing himself harder, as if completing the structure would somehow shield his family from whatever had left those massive footprints. Margaret kept the children closer, their usual adventures along the stream now limited to the clearing's edge. The forest, once a place of curiosity and wonder, felt alive with unseen eyes. The howls continued each night, growing louder and closer. The settlers, scattered across the valley in their own clearings, began to notice strange occurrences as well. Livestock disappeared without a trace, fences were broken, and tools left outside were found bent or mangled. During a rare gathering at the Halsteads' half-finished cabin, the neighboring families shared their stories, their voices hushed as though the forest might be listening. "It's not wolves," said Samuel Turner, a rugged trapper who had lived in the wilderness longer than most. "Wolves don't leave tracks like that, and they don't break fences that high." His words sent a ripple of unease through the group, but no one dared to name what they were beginning to suspect. Emily was the first to see it. It was a brisk autumn morning, and Margaret had sent her to the stream to collect water. Thomas had insisted she take Samuel along, but Emily protested, wanting the chance to prove her independence. Reluctantly, Margaret agreed, but told her to stay within sight of the clearing. Emily promised she would. The forest was quiet as she approached the stream, the bucket swinging in her hand. The air felt heavier than usual, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. She knelt by the water's edge, watching the ripples as she filled the bucket. The sound of the stream was soothing, a small comfort in a place that no longer felt like home. Then she felt it, eyes on her. Slowly, Emily turned her head, her breath hitching as she scanned the opposite bank. At first, she saw nothing, only the dense underbrush and the towering trees beyond. But then, as her eyes adjusted to the shadows, she saw it. The figure stood just beyond the trees, partially hidden by the foliage. At first, she thought it might be a man, but it was far too large. It stood on two legs, its massive frame covered in dark, matted hair that gleamed faintly in the dappled sunlight. Its face was partially obscured, but its eyes, amber and glowing, locked onto hers with an intensity that rooted her to the spot. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared, unable to move or look away. The creature didn't make a sound. It simply watched her, tilting its head slightly as though curious. For a moment, she thought it might step closer, but it remained still, its massive chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. The spell was broken when Emily's bucket slipped from her hand, clattering against the rocks. The sound startled her and she stumbled backward, her heart pounding as she turned and ran. The forest seemed to close in around her as she sprinted back to the clearing, the sound of her own ragged breathing drowning out everything else. When she burst through the trees, her face pale and her body trembling, Margaret ran to her. "Emily, what happened?" she asked, her voice full of panic. Emily could only point back toward the forest, her words catching in her throat. "There's something out there," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was watching me." Thomas and a few of the other men grabbed their rifles and headed to the stream, their expressions grim. They found no sign of the creature, but the fresh footprints in the soft earth told them all they needed to know. Whatever it was real, and it was getting closer. The days following Emily's encounter were marked by a growing sense of dread. The Halsteads were no longer alone in their fear. Word spread quickly among the settlers, and the once determined and hopeful group now walked with an air of nervous vigilance. Even the children, who had once roamed freely, were now confined to their homes, their laughter replaced by whispered questions and wary glances at the darkening tree line. The howls grew bolder, no longer distant and faint. They now erupted from the forest with a terrifying clarity, sending shivers down the spines of all who heard them. At night, the settlers would huddle by their fires, rifles close at hand as the sounds circled their cabins. Heavy footsteps could be heard crunching through the underbrush, and the faint rustling of branches suggested something large moving through the trees. But no one ever saw it, not yet. One night, the unease reached its peak. The Halsteads were gathered in their cabin, the firelight flickering against the walls as Thomas sat sharpening his hunting knife. Margaret was sewing by the fire, her hands working quickly but without the usual precision, her eyes darting to the window every few moments. Emily and Samuel sat silently by the table, their usual chatter replaced by the quiet scratching of Samuel's pencil on paper as he tried to distract himself with drawing. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. It wasn't outside the cabin, it was farther away at the edge of the clearing. But it was close enough to freeze them in place, their breaths caught in their throats. The growl was followed by a long, mournful howl, its pitch rising and falling in a way that sent a wave of primal fear through the room. Thomas stood abruptly, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. Margaret clutched the children, pulling them closer as she whispered, "Stay inside. No matter what you hear, you stay inside." He stepped out into the clearing, his rifle raised and his eyes scanning the darkness. The moon was high, casting a pale, cold light across the clearing, but the forest beyond was a black void, impenetrable and unyielding. Thomas could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he took slow, deliberate steps toward the edge of the trees. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a massive figure standing just beyond the tree line. But as his eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders and thick frame dwarfing the trees around it. Its fur, dark and matted, seemed to blend with the shadows, but its eyes were unmistakable. They glowed a deep amber, catching the moonlight and piercing through the darkness like embers in a dying fire. The creature didn't move. It simply stood there, watching him, its breath visible in the cold night air. Thomas felt the weight of its gaze, and for the first time in his life, he was truly afraid. Not of death, he had faced that fear many times before, but of the unknown, of standing before something that defied explanation. He raised his rifle, his hands trembling, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if studying him, trying to understand what he was. For a moment, it almost seemed curious. Then, with a low, rumbling growl, it turned and melted back into the forest, its massive form disappearing into the shadows. Thomas stood there for what felt like an eternity, his rifle still raised, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. When he finally returned to the cabin, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. "What was it?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. Thomas didn't answer. He simply set the rifle down and sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Whatever it was, he knew one thing for certain: it wasn't done with them yet. And as the forest fell silent once more, the Halsteads knew the creature was out there, waiting, watching, and deciding its next move. The cabin felt smaller now, its walls more like a fragile shell than a refuge. Days passed, but the memory of Thomas's encounter lingered like a heavy fog. He hadn't spoken much since that night, retreating into a tense silence that unnerved Margaret. She watched him from across the room as he checked and rechecked his rifle, his hands methodical but tight with frustration. The children, sensing the unease, played quietly in the corner, their usual laughter replaced by whispered games and wary glances toward the windows. But the forest wasn't quiet. At night, the howls grew louder, more aggressive, as if the creature wanted them to know it was there, circling just beyond their sight. Sometimes heavy thuds could be heard against the cabin walls, and once Margaret awoke to the sound of scratching at the door, long, deliberate strokes that sent chills down her spine. By the time Thomas ran outside, the only sign of the intruder was a set of deep, enormous footprints leading back into the woods. It wasn't just the Halsteads. Their neighbors were also being tormented. One family found their barn torn apart, the heavy wooden doors ripped clean off their hinges. Another reported seeing the creature's shadow in their fields, moving with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for something so large. The settlers gathered again, this time not to share stories, but to strategize. "We need to do something," Samuel Turner said, his voice low but firm. "We can't just sit in our cabins waiting for it to come to us." "And what do you suggest?" another man asked. "Hunt it? Do you even know what it is?" Turner glanced at Thomas, who nodded slowly. "It's not an animal," Thomas said. "It's something else, but it's watching us, testing us, and if we don't act, it'll come for us." The settlers debated late into the night. Some wanted to pack up and leave, abandoning their hard work and dreams of a new life. Others, driven by pride or desperation, argued for a more aggressive approach. In the end, they settled on a compromise. A group of men would venture into the forest to track the creature, armed and ready to confront it if necessary. The rest would stay behind, fortifying the cabins and protecting the children. Thomas was reluctant to leave his family, but knew he couldn't sit idle. Early the next morning, he joined the hunting party as they prepared to enter the woods. The group was small, just 5 men, all experienced hunters, but their faces betrayed their fear. They carried rifles, lanterns, and enough supplies for several days, though none of them expected to be gone that long. The forest swallowed them quickly. The trees, so familiar from the clearing, now loomed like ancient giants, their twisted branches blocking out the sunlight. The air grew colder, heavier, as they pushed deeper into the wilderness. It wasn't long before they found signs of the creature: broken branches, disturbed earth, and those massive footprints, always leading farther into the shadows. The men spoke little, their senses heightened, every sound in the forest a potential threat. As the sun began to set, they reached a clearing and decided to camp for the night. The fire crackled weakly, its light barely reaching the edge of the trees. The men sat close, their rifles within arm's reach, as the forest around them grew impossibly still. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural growl, so low it was almost a vibration. The men froze, their eyes darting to the darkness beyond the firelight. The growl was followed by heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the camp. The lanterns cast long, flickering shadows, but the creature stayed just out of sight. One of the men raised his rifle, his hands trembling. "Show yourself!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The forest responded with a deafening roar, a sound so primal and raw it seemed to shake the ground beneath them. The fire flickered, and for a brief moment they saw it. The massive figure of Bigfoot standing at the edge of the clearing, its glowing amber eyes fixed on them. The creature didn't charge, didn't move closer. It simply watched, its presence enough to send a wave of terror through the group. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, It melted back into the forest, leaving the men shaken and unable to speak. None of them slept that night. They sat in silence, their backs to the fire, their rifles aimed at the shadows. By morning, they all knew the truth. They weren't hunting the creature, it was hunting them, and it was only a matter of time before it made its move. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the forest, the hunting party was already on the move. None of them spoke as they packed up their meager camp, their faces pale and drawn after a sleepless night. The encounter with the creature had shaken them to their core, and though none of them admitted it out loud, they all knew their hunt was futile. They weren't the predators here. They were prey. The forest seemed different now, heavier, as if it were alive and watching their every move. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle of leaves in the distance sent waves of tension through the group. Thomas led the way, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands, his jaw set in grim determination. He had thought he understood the wilderness, thought he could face whatever lived within it. But this was different. This was something that didn't belong to their world. They followed the tracks deeper into the woods, though they no longer had a clear plan. The footprints were fresh, impossibly large, and spaced far apart, as though the creature moved with an effortless speed and power. They came upon more signs of its passage: broken branches, claw marks on tree trunks, and tufts of dark, coarse hair snagged on the undergrowth. Each discovery sent chills through the group, a stark reminder of just how close they were to something they couldn't comprehend. By midday, they reached a ravine where the tracks seemed to vanish. The men fanned out, searching for any sign of where the creature had gone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird. As Thomas knelt by the edge of the ravine, studying the disturbed earth, he felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He wasn't alone. The first sound was a low growl, so deep it seemed to rumble through the ground beneath him. Thomas stood slowly, his rifle raised, as the others rushed to his side. The growl was followed by the sound of heavy footsteps, impossibly fast, circling them just out of sight. The men spun in every direction, their rifles trembling in their hands, but the forest revealed nothing. "Where is it?" one of the men whispered, his voice tight with panic. "Where is it?" Then, without warning, the creature appeared. It burst from the shadows, its massive form a blur of movement as it charged toward the edge of the group. One of the men fired, the sound of the rifle shot echoing through the trees, but it was too late. The creature was gone as quickly as it had appeared, vanishing back into the darkness. But its message was clear. They were trespassers, and it would not tolerate their presence much longer. Panic gripped the group. They no longer cared about the hunt, they just wanted to leave. They retreated hastily, their nerves frayed, their confidence shattered. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing closer, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. The footsteps continued to follow them, never far behind, a constant reminder that the creature was still there, watching, waiting. When they finally stumbled back into the clearing where the settlers had made their homes, they were greeted by the anxious faces of those who had stayed behind. Thomas's expression was all the answer they needed. "It's not something we can fight," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's not something we can stop. We have to leave." There was no argument. The settlers, once so full of hope and determination, now moved with the grim efficiency of people who had accepted their defeat. They began packing their belongings, preparing to abandon the homes they had worked so hard to build. The forest had won. As the Halsteads loaded their wagon, Emily clung to her mother, her wide eyes darting nervously to the tree line. Margaret held her close, whispering reassurances she didn't quite believe. Thomas stood near the edge of the clearing, his rifle still in his hands, his gaze fixed on the forest. He couldn't see the creature, but he knew it was there. It always was. The settlers' exodus was quiet, somber. No one spoke as the wagons rolled away from the clearing, the forest's shadows stretching out as if to pull them back. The Halsteads didn't look back, not even once. They didn't need to. They could feel the weight of the creature's gaze following them, a silent warning that this land would never be theirs. The wagons creaked and groaned as the settlers made their way down the overgrown trail, the forest towering around them like the walls of a dark cathedral. The journey out was a far cry from the hopeful procession that had brought them in. Now there was no chatter, no laughter, no eager anticipation of what lay ahead. The settlers moved in silence. The only sounds, the steady clop of horse hooves, the rumble of wagon wheels, and the faint rustling of leaves in the cold wind. For Thomas Halstead, every step felt heavier than the last. He walked alongside the wagon, his rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest no longer felt like a place of promise. It was a predator's lair, and they were intruding on borrowed time. He could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes following them, lurking just beyond the edges of their vision. And he wasn't alone in feeling it. The other settlers glanced nervously over their shoulders, their faces pale and drawn, their hands gripping weapons that felt useless against what they had encountered. The children, normally so restless and curious, sat quietly in the wagons, their small bodies huddled together for comfort. Emily clung to her mother's side, her wide eyes darting to the trees as though expecting the creature to emerge at any moment. Margaret tried to soothe her, whispering soft reassurances, but the tremor in her own voice betrayed her fear. She gripped Emily's hand tightly, as if letting go would allow the forest to take her. As the hours dragged on, the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows longer and deeper despite the midday sun. The air felt heavier, colder, as though the forest itself was closing in around them. Every now and then, Thomas thought he heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, impossibly heavy, pacing them just out of sight. Once, he caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow too large to be an animal slipping between the trees. But when he turned to look, it was gone. The tension reached a breaking point as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The wagons came to a halt as the settlers debated whether to press on through the night or risk camping in the open. "We can't stop," Thomas said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the group. "It's waiting for us. We stop, and we give it a chance." But the horses were tired, their breath visible in the cooling air, and the children were too exhausted to continue. Reluctantly, the settlers decided to make camp in a small clearing by the trail. They built a perimeter of fires, their flames flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. The men stood guard in shifts, their rifles ready, but the forest remained eerily silent, the oppressive quiet broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. As the night stretched on, the silence became unbearable. Then, just as the settlers began to believe they might be safe, the howls returned. Low, mournful, and impossibly close, they echoed through the trees, sending a wave of panic through the camp. The men gripped their rifles tighter, their eyes darting to the shadows. The footsteps came next, slow and deliberate, circling the camp in a chilling mimicry of the previous night's events. Thomas stood at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest as he scanned the darkness. He knew it was out there, just beyond the firelight, watching, waiting. And though he couldn't see it, he could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like a storm about to break. The howls continued into the early hours of the morning, but the creature never showed itself. By dawn, the settlers were exhausted, their nerves frayed, and their hope all but gone. They packed up the camp in silence, moving faster now, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the forest. But even as the trees began to thin, as the trail opened up to the rolling hills beyond, none of them could shake the feeling that the creature was still there, watching from the shadows, letting them leave, but only just. Thomas glanced back one last time as they crossed the boundary of the forest, his eyes lingering on the tree line. For a moment, he thought he saw it, those glowing amber eyes barely visible among the shadows. Then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The settlers were free, but the forest would never truly release them. It had marked them, claimed them, and its shadow would follow them forever. The settlers eventually reached the open plains, leaving the oppressive forest behind, but the weight of their ordeal did not lift. The relief of escaping the dense, shadowy woods was tempered by the knowledge of what they had encountered. None of them spoke about it as they made their way to the nearest settlement. The air was heavy with unspoken fear. Each person lost in their own thoughts, haunted by memories of the creature that had driven them from their dreams of a new life. For the Halsteads, the journey was particularly painful. They had left behind everything they had worked for, the half-built cabin, their livestock, and the promise of a fresh start. Emily sat in the back of the wagon, her gaze fixed on the horizon, though her thoughts were still trapped in the forest. She couldn't forget the glowing amber eyes that had watched her at the stream, nor the heavy, deliberate footsteps that had haunted them through the woods. Margaret, sitting beside her, quietly stroked her daughter's hair, but her own face was pale, her eyes distant. She, too, felt the weight of what they had escaped, and the dread of knowing they had been spared, not saved. Thomas walked beside the wagon, his rifle still in his hands despite the open terrain. He hadn't spoken much since they left the forest, his jaw set and his eyes constantly scanning the landscape. He knew they were safe now. Safer, at least, but the creature's presence lingered in his mind. It had been watching them, studying them, letting them leave. It could have attacked, could have ended them at any moment, but it hadn't. That choice unnerved him more than anything else. It had shown restraint, intelligence, a deliberate decision to let them go. Why? When they finally reached the settlement, the Halsteads and the other families were greeted with curious, concerned looks. The settlers who had stayed behind had heard the rumors, whispers of strange sounds, missing livestock, and massive footprints. But seeing the state of the returning group confirmed the worst. Their faces, their haunted eyes, told a story no words could fully convey. At a gathering that night, Thomas was asked to explain what had happened. He stood before the small crowd, his broad shoulders hunched, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "There's something in those woods," he said simply. "Something we can't explain. It's not an animal, not a man. It's something older, something that doesn't want us there." Some of the settlers scoffed, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others listened in silence, their faces pale, their hands fidgeting nervously. The elders of the settlement exchanged knowing glances, their expressions grim. They had heard stories before, legends passed down by the native tribes who had long avoided those woods. Stories of a guardian, a creature that protected the forest and punished those who trespassed too deeply. The Halsteads tried to move on, to rebuild their lives in the safety of the settlement. But the memory of the forest stayed with them. Emily refused to go near the edge of the woods, even in daylight, and often woke from nightmares, her screams piercing the quiet nights. Margaret buried herself in work, but her hands often trembled and her gaze would drift toward the distant tree line. Thomas, ever the protector, kept his rifle close, as if expecting the creature to follow them, though he knew it wouldn't need to. It had already marked them. As the years passed, the story of what happened in the forest became a local legend. Hunters and travelers who ventured near the area reported hearing strange howls at night or finding enormous footprints in the mud. Some claimed to have seen glowing eyes in the shadows, though none dared venture too far. The settlers who had fled the forest never returned, and the clearing where their dreams had once taken root was reclaimed by the trees, the cabins slowly rotting away under a canopy of moss and vines. Thomas, now an older man with streaks of gray in his hair, often sat on the porch of his modest home, staring out at the horizon. On quiet nights when the wind blew just right, he swore he could hear it, the faint echo of a howl carried on the breeze. He would grip his rifle tighter and remind himself that he was safe now, that the forest was far behind him. But deep down, he knew the truth. The creature wasn't bound by the trees. It wasn't bound by anything. It was part of something larger, something eternal, and it would never truly let them go. And though the forest was miles away, its shadow lingered in their hearts, a constant reminder that some places are not meant to be tamed, and some secrets are best left undisturbed. The late 19th century was a time of promise for those bold enough to venture westward. Among the endless forests and untamed wilderness of the Pacific Northwest lay the dream of freedom, land, and opportunity. For the Caldwell family, this journey was more than a choice. It was their future. John Caldwell, his wife Martha, and their two sons, William and Andrew, packed everything they owned into a wagon and followed the trail deep into the heart of the wilderness. They left behind the noise and suffocation of the East for what they hoped would be a new beginning. The journey was long and exhausting, but as they emerged into a secluded clearing surrounded by towering evergreens, a sense of relief washed over them. The land was lush and fertile, with a stream winding its way through the trees and a canopy so dense that it blocked out the harsh midday sun. To John, this felt like the perfect place to build a home, a sanctuary for his family. As he helped unload the wagon, he glanced at Martha and the boys, who were already exploring their new surroundings. He smiled, though deep inside a faint unease tugged at him, a feeling he couldn't quite place. The first few days passed uneventfully. The Caldwells worked tirelessly to clear the land, gather resources, and lay the foundation for their cabin. Each swing of John's axe echoed through the stillness of the forest, a declaration of their presence in this vast, untouched land. The boys laughed and played by the stream, their voices filling the air with life. But as the sun dipped below the horizon each night, the forest seemed to change. The cheerful rustling of leaves and chirping of crickets gave way to an unnatural stillness, as if the trees were holding their breath. Martha was the first to notice the silence. She mentioned it to John one evening as they sat by the fire. "It's too quiet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John brushed off her concerns, attributing it to the unfamiliarity of their new surroundings. But even he couldn't deny the weight of the silence, the way it pressed against them, making the vast forest feel strangely claustrophobic. It wasn't long before the first sign of something unusual appeared. Early one morning, as John walked to the edge of the clearing to survey the land, he spotted them. Massive footprints pressed into the soft earth. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen. Long, broad, and distinctly human-like, but impossibly large. He crouched beside them, measuring the size with his hand. They were fresh, the edges of the impressions still crisp, as though whatever had made them had passed through only hours before. John didn't say anything to Martha or the boys. He told himself it was just a bear or some other animal, though the shape and sheer size of the prints gnawed at the back of his mind. He decided to keep the discovery to himself, hoping it was nothing. But as the days passed, other strange occurrences began to pile up. Tools left outside were found scattered across the clearing, some bent or broken. The livestock, restless and agitated, began disappearing without a trace, leaving behind only patches of disturbed earth. At night, Martha swore she heard heavy footsteps outside the cabin, slow and deliberate, pacing in the darkness. John stayed up late by the fire, his rifle resting across his lap, listening to the stillness of the forest. The unease he'd felt since they arrived grew heavier with each passing day. He began to wonder if they were alone in the clearing, or if something was watching them from the shadows of the trees, waiting. Whatever it was biding its time, and deep down, John knew they had disturbed something far older than their dreams of a new life. The unease deepened as the days wore on. The forest, which had once seemed a haven, now felt alive with an unseen presence. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the feeling, the gnawing sensation of being watched. Martha noticed it too, though she tried to hide her fear from the boys. She focused on her chores, keeping the cabin tidy and ensuring William and Andrew stayed close to the clearing. But every so often she would pause, staring toward the tree line, her eyes scanning the shadows as if expecting something to step out. One morning, as John prepared to venture into the woods to gather timber, he noticed something strange near the edge of the clearing. The massive footprints were back, but this time they were closer, just beyond the cabin, as if whatever had left them had been circling their home. The tracks were deeper than before, pressed into the soft earth with deliberate weight, as though the creature had paused to observe. John knelt by the tracks, his brow furrowed. He didn't want to alarm Martha, but the sight of the footprints sent a chill down his spine. He followed the trail for a short distance into the woods, his rifle slung across his shoulder. The tracks weaved through the trees, erratic and strange, before vanishing abruptly as if the creature had taken to the trees or simply disappeared. Uneasy, John returned to the clearing, determined to keep the discovery to himself. There was no use frightening his family. Not yet. That evening, as the family gathered for supper, Martha broke the uneasy silence that had settled over them. "I heard it again last night," she said quietly, her voice strained. John looked up from his plate, his expression hardening. "The footsteps. They were right outside the cabin. I swear it, John." "It's just an animal," he replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "Probably a bear or a cougar. Nothing we can't handle." Martha didn't argue, but the worry in her eyes lingered. William and Andrew, sensing the tension, stayed silent, though they too had noticed the strange things happening around their new home. The boys had stopped playing near the stream, unwilling to stray far from their parents. Even their laughter, once so vibrant, had faded into quiet murmurs. The turning point came just 2 days later. Martha had sent William and Andrew to gather water from the stream under the condition that they stay within sight of the clearing. The boys were reluctant, but eventually relented, taking a single bucket between them. Martha watched them go, her hands tightening on the washboard she'd been using. Minutes passed, and then Martha heard it, their screams. She dropped what she was doing and ran toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. She found the boys standing near the stream, frozen in terror. They didn't speak, didn't move. Instead, they pointed toward the trees on the opposite bank. Martha followed their gaze, and what she saw made her blood run cold. There, just beyond the shadows of the trees, stood a figure. It was massive, towering over the underbrush, its broad shoulders and powerful frame covered in dark, matted hair. Its face was partially obscured, but its eyes, those amber, glowing eyes, were unmistakable. They locked onto her, filled with an intelligence that was almost human, yet entirely foreign. The creature stood still, its chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths as though assessing them. Martha pulled the boys close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't move," she said, her eyes fixed on the creature. The three of them stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, until, without a sound, the creature turned and stepped back into the trees, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. She hurried the boys back to the cabin, her mind racing. When John returned that evening, she told him what had happened. His face darkened as he listened, and though he tried to reassure her, she could see the fear in his eyes. They were no longer alone in the clearing. Something else was there with them, something that watched, waited, and calculated. That night, as the family huddled by the fire, the howls began. Low, mournful, and impossibly deep, they echoed through the trees surrounding the cabin. Whatever was out there wanted them to know it was close. The forest, once their refuge, had turned into something far more sinister, and John knew that whatever left those howls wasn't going to leave them alone. Not anymore. The howls continued each night, growing closer and louder, until they seemed to vibrate through the walls of the cabin. It was as if the forest itself was alive, a vast, breathing entity that had turned its gaze squarely on the Caldwell family. The boys no longer ventured outside, even during the day. Martha kept them busy with chores inside the cabin, though the distraction did little to ease their growing anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, set them on edge. John began sleeping in his chair near the door, his rifle across his lap. He hadn't said much since Martha's sighting at the stream. His silence was unsettling, but it was clear he was grappling with a mounting sense of helplessness. The more he tried to convince himself that it was just an animal, the more obvious it became that this was something far beyond his understanding. One night, just before dawn, the heavy footsteps returned. Slow, deliberate, and far too close, they circled the cabin like a predator sizing up its prey. Martha sat up in bed, clutching the boys close, her eyes wide as the sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other. John was already at the window, his rifle readier, but he simply stood there, staring into the darkness. "Can you see it?" Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "No," John replied, his tone grim, "but it's out there." For hours, the footsteps continued, pausing at intervals, as if the creature was listening, waiting. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, they stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. The family stayed inside until the sun was fully up, but even then, none of them ventured beyond the clearing that day. The next evening, John made the decision to gather the neighboring settlers. It was clear they weren't the only ones experiencing strange happenings, and if there was any chance of driving off whatever was out there, they would need to act together. The meeting was held at the Caldwell cabin, with a small group of settlers crammed into the tiny space. Their faces were pale, their expressions grim. "It's not just us," one man said, his voice tight. "My livestock's been disappearing too. No tracks, no sign of a struggle, just gone." Another added, "I've heard it at night, pacing outside my cabin. It's like it knows I'm there, but it's not afraid. That's what scares me the most. It's not afraid of us. John recounted Martha's encounter at the stream and the footprints he'd seen, describing the creature's size and its glowing amber eyes. His words hung heavy in the room, met with murmurs and fearful glances. Some of the settlers spoke of similar sightings, of shadows too large to be human and howls that seemed to carry a warning. Samuel Turner, a grizzled hunter who had lived on the frontier longer than anyone else, finally broke the tense silence. "I've heard stories like this before," he said. "The natives speak of a guardian of the forest, something ancient, something that doesn't like outsiders. They call it Bigfoot." The name lingered in the air, a chilling echo that sent shivers down Martha's spine. Some scoffed, dismissing it as folklore, but the rest listened intently. "It doesn't matter what it is," John said firmly. "What matters is it's here, and it's not going to stop. We need to do something before it decides we're not worth leaving alone." A plan was hastily formed. The men would organize a patrol, armed and ready to confront whatever was stalking their homes. They would venture deep into the forest, follow the tracks, and force the creature out of their territory. It was a desperate idea, but desperation was all they had left. As the settlers dispersed, John watched them go, his jaw set and his hands clenched into fists. He knew this was a gamble, and in his gut he feared they were underestimating what they were up against. That night, as he sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, the forest seemed quieter than usual. But it wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind that promised something worse was coming. The night of the patrol began with an unnatural stillness, the kind that presses against your ears and leaves your skin crawling. The settlers gathered just before dusk, rifles slung over their shoulders and lanterns in hand. The group was small, just 6 men, including John, each determined to confront the creature that had turned their lives into a waking nightmare. They exchanged tense nods as they set out, leaving the women and children behind in the safety of their homes, though none of them truly believed the cabins would be enough to stop whatever was out there. The forest swallowed them quickly, its dense canopy cutting off the fading light of the evening. The air was heavy and cold, carrying with it a faint, damp smell that clung to their clothes. The men walked in a tight formation, their boots crunching softly against the forest floor. No one spoke, but their silence was filled with an unspoken fear, a shared understanding that they were entering something else's territory. They followed the tracks first, those same enormous footprints John had seen near the clearing. The impressions were fresh, the edges crisp in the soft soil. They wound through the trees in erratic patterns, leading deeper into the forest, where the shadows grew darker and the air thicker. Every now and then, one of the men would stop and listen, his eyes darting into the darkness, but the forest remained eerily silent. It wasn't until the sun had fully disappeared that the first sound came. A low, guttural growl rippled through the air, so deep it felt as though the ground itself was vibrating. The men froze, their lanterns swinging as they scanned the shadows for the source. The growl was followed by heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling just beyond the reach of their lanterns. It was close, closer than any of them had expected. "Stay together," John whispered, his voice barely audible. He gripped his rifle tightly, his knuckles white. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the forest fell silent once more. The men stood in tense anticipation, their breath fogging in the cold night air, but nothing happened. As they pushed on, the growls came again, this time from multiple directions. The creature, or creatures, were toying with them, moving through the trees with an unnatural speed and precision. Shadows flickered at the edges of their lantern light, too large to be deer or bears. The men raised their rifles, their hands trembling, but they couldn't see the target. "Over there!" one of the men shouted, pointing into the darkness. The lanterns swung toward the sound, illuminating nothing but trees and dense underbrush. Then, with a suddenness that made their blood run cold, it stepped into view. The creature was massive, its towering form emerging from the shadows like something out of a nightmare. Its glowing amber eyes fixed on them with an intensity that sent a primal terror through the group. Its fur was matted and dark, blending with the forest around it, but its sheer size and presence made it impossible to mistake for anything natural. For a moment, no one moved. The creature simply stood there, its chest rising and falling with deep, deliberate breaths. Then, with a guttural roar, it took a step forward. The sound shattered the silence, sending the men stumbling backward in fear. One of them fired, the rifle shot echoing through the trees, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it let out another deafening roar, a sound so primal and raw that it seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. And then it was gone, disappearing back into the shadows with an almost unnatural swiftness. The men didn't wait to see if it would return. Panic overtook them as they stumbled back toward the clearing, their lanterns swinging wildly, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest, once so quiet, now seemed alive with movement, the sound of heavy footsteps following them, never too far behind. When they finally emerged into the safety of the clearing, they were met with the wide-eyed stares of the women and children who had been waiting for their return. The men didn't speak of what they had seen. They didn't need to. Their pale faces and trembling hands told the story well enough. John stepped into the cabin and sank into his chair by the fire, his rifle still clutched tightly in his hands. He stared into the flames. The image of the creature burned into his mind. It wasn't just an animal. It was something far more intelligent, far more dangerous. And it wasn't finished with them. The forest had sent its warning. Now it was only a matter of time before it struck again. The settlers woke to a somber and oppressive morning. The sky above the clearing was gray, heavy with low-hanging clouds that seemed to mirror the mood of those below. The forest, usually full of the soft calls of birds and the rustle of wildlife, remained eerily silent. No one spoke of the previous night, but the fear was written on their faces. It was clear to all of them now. This was not their land. It belonged to something else, something older and more powerful. And whatever it was, it had no intention of letting them stay. John Caldwell stepped out of the cabin, his rifle slung over his shoulder, and surveyed the clearing. The tracks were back. They circled the cabin, closer now, more deliberate. Whatever had left them had been watching them again while they slept, its intentions unreadable, but its presence undeniable. Martha stood by the doorway, clutching Andrew and William close. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had stopped asking John what they were going to do. She already knew the answer. The other settlers began to gather, their own expressions heavy with resignation. Samuel Turner, the grizzled hunter, was the first to speak. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's playing with us, testing us. And if we wait too long, it'll do more than that." A murmur of agreement swept through the group. The settlers had faced countless hardships before, wild animals, harsh weather, even sickness. But this was different. This wasn't something they could fight. They weren't just outmatched, they were outsmarted. "We have to leave," John finally said, his voice breaking the silence. "Pack what we can, take the wagons, and go. The longer we stay, the more dangerous it'll get." The decision was made quickly, though it was not an easy one. Abandoning the clearing meant giving up months of hard work, half-built cabins, livestock, crops planted in freshly tilled soil. But the settlers knew the alternative. No amount of land or dreams of prosperity was worth their lives. The rest of the day was spent in hurried preparation. Martha and the boys packed what little they could fit into the wagon while John checked their supplies and readied the horses. The other families did the same, their movements quick and efficient, spurred on by an unspoken urgency. The forest seemed to close in around them as the hours passed, the shadows growing longer, the air heavier. Even the children, usually full of energy and questions, worked quietly, their eyes darting to the tree line with every sound. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the wagons were ready. The settlers gathered in a somber procession, their faces illuminated by the faint orange glow of the setting sun. As they started down the trail that led away from the clearing, the forest seemed to press closer, as if reluctant to let them go. The journey was tense, every creak of the wagons and snap of a branch setting the settlers on edge. John walked beside his family's wagon, his rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the shadows. He could feel it. Feel them. The creature, or creatures, were following them, just beyond the edges of their vision. Every so often, he would catch a flicker of movement, a shadow too large to be an animal slipping between the trees. But when he turned to look, there was nothing. The howls began just as night fell. Low and mournful, they echoed through the forest, growing louder and closer with each passing moment. The settlers pushed the horses harder, their breaths visible in the cold night air as they urged the wagons forward. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the darkness like a thread through a needle. Finally, the forest began to thin, the trees giving way to open plains. The settlers didn't stop until they were miles away, the oppressive shadows of the woods far behind them. When they finally came to a halt, exhaustion overtook them. The children fell asleep in the wagons, while the adults stood in silence, staring back at the dark line of trees on the horizon. John stayed awake that night, sitting by the wagon with his rifle across his lap. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even now out in the open. As he stared at the distant forest, he thought he saw them. Two faint amber lights glowing in the darkness, unblinking, watching. And then they were gone, swallowed by the shadows. The settlers were safe for now, but John knew the forest hadn't truly let them go. Whatever lived in those woods had marked them, a silent warning that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The morning came quietly, the kind of silence that should have brought comfort but didn't. The settlers, now miles away from the forest's edge, began to regroup. They had made it out, but none of them felt safe. The oppressive weight of the forest was no longer around them, yet its memory lingered. The howls that had chased them through the night seemed to echo in their minds, impossible to forget. For the first time, the group allowed themselves to stop and rest, though their movements remained hurried and tense. John Caldwell stood apart from the others, his rifle still in his hands, scanning the horizon. The plains stretched out before them, the forest now a dark smudge on the horizon behind them. He should have felt relief at the distance, but instead he felt exposed, vulnerable. The forest had been dangerous, but its shadows had also hidden them. Out here in the open, it was as though there was nowhere to hide. Martha approached him, her face drawn and pale. "We're far enough now, aren't we?" she asked, her voice trembling. She looked back toward the distant tree line, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. John didn't answer immediately. He wanted to say yes, to reassure her that the danger was behind them, but he couldn't. He'd seen too much, felt too much. "We'll keep moving," he said instead, his voice firm but low. "We can't stop yet." The other settlers shared his unease. Though they were beyond the forest, they all felt it. An invisible tether pulling at them, a presence that hadn't let them go. Some of the men whispered amongst themselves, debating whether the creatures would follow or if they were tied to the woods. No one knew for sure, and no one was brave enough to test the theory. As the wagons began moving again, the mood grew heavier. The open plains offered no cover, no shelter, and every sound carried across the vast emptiness. The settlers' eyes were drawn to the horizon, scanning for movement, for shadows that didn't belong. The children, sensing the tension in the adults, remained quiet. Even William and Andrew, who had always found adventure in the journey, sat silently in the wagon, their small faces pressed against the wood, watching the distant tree line grow smaller. By mid-afternoon, the group reached a shallow valley, a place where they could briefly rest without feeling completely exposed. The wagons formed a loose circle, the horses tied and watered while the settlers prepared a quick meal. Despite the sunlight, the unease remained. It was as though the shadow of the forest had followed them, an invisible specter haunting their every step. John sat with his back to the wagon wheel, his rifle resting across his knees. His eyes never stopped scanning the horizon, particularly the distant forest. He tried to shake the feeling, the sense that they were still being watched, but it clung to him like a second skin. Then he saw it. Far off, just a faint shape against the fading line of trees, something moved. It was brief, a flicker of shadow among the green and brown of the forest. He froze, his hand tightening around the rifle's stock, but the shape didn't reappear. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the light, his exhausted mind playing games, but the feeling in his gut told him otherwise. Martha saw him staring and followed his gaze. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing," John lied, shaking his head. He didn't want to frighten her more than she already was, but he kept his rifle close, his eyes drifting back to the distant trees every few moments. As night fell, the settlers built small fires, their flames flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. The plains felt vast and exposed in the moonlight, and the settlers gathered close, their voices hushed. No one dared mention the forest, but it lingered in their minds, unspoken yet present in every glance, every movement. That night, as the others drifted into uneasy sleep, John stayed awake, watching the horizon. The stars above were bright, the plains bathed in a silvery light, but the distant forest remained a dark smear, silent and unmoving. Or so it seemed. Then, in the faintest sliver of moonlight, he saw them, two glowing amber eyes, far off but unmistakable, staring out from the edge of the forest. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. John gripped his rifle tighter, his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't look away. Eventually, the eyes disappeared, swallowed by the shadows. But John knew they were still there. The forest had let them leave, but it hadn't forgotten them. And somewhere out in the darkness, it was still watching, waiting. The settlers eventually reached the edge of a larger settlement, a cluster of cabins and farms nestled against the open plains. It was a stark contrast to the dense, impenetrable forest they had left behind, but the relief they should have felt upon seeing it was dulled by the weight of what they had endured. The wagons rolled in silently, the group hollow-eyed and weary, their faces etched with fear that hadn't yet faded. John helped Martha and the boys down from their wagon, his movements slow and deliberate. His rifle never left his side, even now, even here, as if the act of putting it down might somehow summon the creature back to them. He could see the questions in the faces of the settlers who had been living here, the curious glances, the murmured whispers, but no one approached them. Their haggard appearance told a story too unsettling to invite further inquiry. Later that evening, as the families unpacked what little they had salvaged, John joined a gathering of the settlement's leaders. Seated around a fire, the men listened as John explained what had happened, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of their ordeal. He described the footprints, the howls, the creature that had followed them, and the glowing amber eyes that still haunted his dreams. At first, there was disbelief. A few men scoffed, shaking their heads. "It was probably just a bear," one said dismissively, though his tone lacked conviction. But as John continued, as he spoke of the creature's intelligence, its calculated movements, its unshakable presence, the mood shifted. Some of the older settlers exchanged glances, their expressions darkening. "There have been stories," one of them finally said, his voice low. "The natives talk about it. They say the forest has a guardian, something that protects it, something that doesn't want us there. They call it Bigfoot." The name hung in the air, heavy and final. It wasn't a name born of understanding, but of fear, a label for something beyond comprehension. John didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was something they all felt deep down, whether they wanted to admit it or not. Whatever it wasn't just a creature. It was something ancient, something tied to the land in ways they couldn't understand. The days turned into weeks, and the Caldwells began to rebuild their lives in the safety of the settlement. But the shadow of the forest never left them. Martha kept the boys close, refusing to let them wander beyond the small perimeter of the settlement. William and Andrew no longer spoke of the forest, but John could see it in their eyes, the fear, the memory of what they had seen. It had marked them, just as it had marked him. John himself found little solace. At night, when the settlement was quiet and the stars shone brightly above, he often sat alone on the porch of their small cabin, staring out toward the horizon. The forest was miles away now, a distant smudge against the edge of the world. But he could still feel it, as though it had rooted itself in his mind. The glowing amber eyes, the deep howls, the deliberate footsteps, they were burned into his memory. One night, as the wind picked up and rustled the grass around him, John swore he heard it, the faintest echo of a howl, carried across the plains. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down his spine. He gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white, and stared out into the darkness. He knew it was still out there. The forest might have let them leave, but it hadn't forgotten them. It had allowed them to live, to escape, but it hadn't truly let them go. It was waiting, watching, its presence lingering like a shadow that could never be outrun. Years later, long after the Caldwells had settled into their new lives, the stories persisted. Hunters and travelers who ventured too close to the forest spoke of strange sounds, of massive footprints in the mud, of a feeling of being watched. The legend of Bigfoot grew, passed down in whispers, a warning to those who might dare to disturb the forest's secrets. John Caldwell never returned to the forest, but he carried it with him until the end of his days. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right and the world seemed still, he would sometimes look to the horizon and wonder if it was still watching him. Deep down, he already knew the answer. Some things never let go. Some things never fade.